Welcome. Two shadows never sleep. Here night never ends. And every story hides something waiting to be found. From haunted houses buried deep in forgotten American towns, to Halloween nights that went horribly wrong, and old legends whispered by those who claimed they saw something right before the lights went out. So sit back, turn off the lights, and let the shadows tell you what they've been keeping. The air inside Northwood High was always cold, but it wasn't the kind of chill that came from a faulty HVAC system. It was the temperature of history, of regret, of things left unsaid and undone, and it clung heaviest in the dead hours between midnight and 4 a.m., when only the janitorial staff and maybe one lone, unfortunate student were left to witness the silence. It's the silence, you see, that always gets you the moment. The final echoes of the hallway lights, buzzing, fade into nothing but the sound of your own panicked heart. This is the story of Alex Chen, not a student, but a night cleaner trying to put himself through community college, a person who thought the ghosts in an old building were just creaking pipes and rattling windows, until he found the tapes in the maintenance closet behind the boiler room, stacked neatly next to a half-used bottle of industrial floor wax. Alex's job was simple: mop the science wing, empty the bins in the administration offices, and make sure the cafeteria was spotless for the morning rush. He had been doing this for 7 months, 7 months of reliable, monotonous solitude, 7 months where the only thing he feared was getting caught. Taking a 15-minute nap in the principal's leather chair, he had the run of the place, an old Victorian structure built in 1908. Full of dark wood and even darker stories. The local urban legend was the disappearance of a student named Sarah Jenkins back in the 1970s, who supposedly walked into the library archives and never came out. Most people wrote it off as a runaway. Alex thought nothing of it until one Tuesday night, while clearing out Mr. Henderson's old maintenance locker, space marked for demolition. He discovered a heavy wooden box hidden behind a loose sheet of plywood near the floorboards. Inside, there were 3 things: a tattered, oil-stained name badge for J. Elias, Lead Custodian, 1968 a 1994, a small, tarnished silver key, and a stack of microcassette tapes, all labeled with dates and room numbers in faded black ink. The first tape was labeled the 14th of May 1983. Basement, boiler check. Curiosity, that insidious, quiet vice, took hold. Alex had an old cassette player in his truck, a relic from his father. He took the tape, drove out to the empty parking lot, and listened. What he heard was not the expected sound of machinery, but scraping, rhythmic, metallic scraping, followed by the muffled sound of weeping. So faint, it was almost swallowed by the hiss of the tape. Elias, the janitor, spoke in a low, gravelly voice. Another one: "Damn floorboards are getting loose again. Better log it as a heating issue before the morning." The sound that followed was the key turning in a lock, and then silence, replaced only by the endless scrape. Scraped out. The discovery immediately changed Alex's perception of the school. The creaks were no longer just the building settling. They were something trying to break free. The cold drafts weren't poor insulation. They were the passing of something that didn't generate heat. He started comparing the dates and room numbers on the tapes to old newspaper archives he could access through his college library account. The date, the 14th of May 1983, corresponded exactly with the date a local high school student, Jimmy Crawl, who was a known runaway risk, was reported missing. The school always claimed he just never came back from a field trip. Elias's log, however, said boiler check. The key, it turned out, opened a small, unused storage room adjacent to the main boiler in the very deepest part of the sub-basement. A room that was always locked and which Alex had been explicitly told never to enter due to electrical hazards. With dread tightening his chest, he used the silver key. The room smelled of mildew and stale air, but underneath it, something else. Earth, freshly turned, and the metallic temps of old copper. The room was mostly empty, save for a shelf of ancient, rusted tools. But Alex noticed something the night crew, or anyone else, would miss: the specific pattern of dust accumulation on the far wall, where the concrete met the floor. The dust was slightly disturbed in a precise, rectangular outline, and a thin, almost invisible line marked where a false section of the floor had been pulled up and recently put back. He realized the scraping on the tape wasn't the floorboards, it was a shovel. The weeping wasn't a student. It was a desperate sound, silenced forever. Elias wasn't logging a heating issue. He was logging the successful disposal of another problem. The school wasn't haunted by a restless spirit. It was haunted by the weight of concrete covering intentional, systemic cruelty. Alex took the rest of the tapes. There were 23 in total, spanning from 1971 to 1993. Each labeled with a date and a room number, always a secluded, rarely used part of the building. The rooms varied: the old gymnasium storage closet, the rarely accessed attic above the music department, and, most frequently, the sub-basement. Every single date coincided perfectly with a student disappearance, or an unexplained staff departure, reported in the local papers as moved away suddenly, or transferred schools mid-semester. The horror wasn't a single ghost or a single tragedy. It was a pattern, a meticulously maintained, decades-long cover-up run by a janitor and, frighteningly, perhaps sanctioned by the administration, who kept his locker untouched for years. On the last tape, dated Christmas Eve, 1993, the voice of Elias was weaker, raspy. He wasn't talking about scraping or floorboards. He was whispering a warning into the mic, a feverish confession about the school itself. It feeds, not just on them, but on the silence. The more we bury, the hungrier the walls get. They wanted me to seal the archives, but the archives are only the key to the foundation. It's the whole damn place, Alex. Don't fix the lights. Don't check the boiler. Just burn the tapes and run, or you'll be the one logging the next heating issue yourself. The tape ended with a choking sound, followed by a heavy, wet silence. Alex never heard Elias's name mentioned in the school records again after 1994, listed only as retired. But the silver key was still in his hand, and the rectangular outline in the sub-basement concrete was still faintly visible beneath the thin layer of dust. Alex knew his job was no longer just cleaning. It was finding out who, or what, Elias was protecting, and why the school needed to be so perpetually, chillingly silent after dark. He put the key back on the floor where he found it, but kept the tapes, knowing that the real reason behind Northwood High's chilling atmosphere wasn't a girl who ran away, but the terrible, enduring dedication of a janitor to his darkest duties. The real horror was that the system worked, and the school continued to stand, quietly humming with the weight of the bodies beneath its floor. The last time Alex was seen, he had left a large industrial cleaner running in the boiler room, masking the sounds of his movements as he tried to lift the concrete slab in the storage room. He never came back to his shift the next morning, and his car remained parked in the faculty lot. The police report mentioned a possible mental breakdown due to stress and a sudden departure, logging his disappearance under runaway. The janitorial supervisor simply assigned the cleaning duties to a new hire the next week, noting on the internal log, boiler room, minor maintenance log, date, today, status, resolved, status, resolved. The second true story comes from the grounds of St. Jude's Preparatory, an exclusive boarding school established in 1898 on the Northern Cliffs, notorious for its strict discipline and, more secretly, its connection to the sea. The sea air didn't just carry salt, it carried the faint, decaying scent of old wood and the distant, mournful cry of gulls. A cry which the students insisted often sounded less like a bird and more like a name being whispered on the tide. This particular tale focuses on the silent bell tower. St. Jude's had a magnificent, towering clock tower that had been non-functional since 1952, when lightning struck the pinnacle, bending the iron spire into a grotesque twist. The administration proudly maintained the broken tower as a historical monument, a symbol of resilience. However, the clock face itself, permanently stopped at 3 a.m., became a silent marker for something much more disturbing. The story begins with a new student, Liam, a scholarship boy from the mainland, who was assigned a room in the oldest dormitory wing, which faced the damaged tower. Liam was a light sleeper, and the very first week, he was jolted awake not by an alarm, but by the unmistakable sound of the tower bell chiming. Not a full hour chime, but a single, deep, resonant toll. He checked his phone. It was 3 a.m., the exact time the clock hands were frozen. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to a hallucination or some local oddity, until it happened again the following night, and the night after that. The single chime always happened at 3 a.m., never before, never after. When he cautiously asked his roommate, an upperclassman named Marcus, about the bell, Marcus's face went white. "The tower hasn't rung since before my father came here. Don't talk about it," he warned, his voice a low, fierce whisper. Liam quickly learned the chilling rule of St. Jude's. Everyone knew the tower rang, but no one acknowledged it. The staff, the senior students, even the long-serving headmaster, they all lived under the shared unspoken agreement that the silent bell tower remained silent. Liam began keeping a secret journal, logging every time the bell tolled. It wasn't random. It only tolled on nights following a specific, unsettling event within the school. Once it was after a particularly harsh disciplinary session where a student was publicly humiliated. Another time, it was after a rare failure in the school's academic record, when a student failed to gain entry into an Ivy League university. But the most terrifying discovery was the correlation between the tolling and the history archives. Liam discovered through clandestine trips to the library that the bells seemed to toll precisely 24 hours after a significant, often violent, act of suppression or tragedy in the school's past was mentioned or brought up in a conversation. He found an old, faded black and white photograph in the deep archives showing the tower before the lightning strike. In that photograph, there was a small, ornate plaque near the base of the tower, which was now covered by climbing ivy in the modern era. He managed to sneak out late one night, armed with a flashlight and a pocket knife, and scrape away the growth. The plaque was inscribed with a Latin phrase that translated to, "It is not time, it measures, but the debt it holds." The realization that the tower was not marking time, but judging the moral failings of the school itself, sent a profound dread through him. The bell only rang when the silence of the institution was about to be broken by a reminder of its past cruelties. The single chime wasn't a warning, it was a record. It was the sound of the school's history, refusing to be forgotten. The tower, stopped at 3 a.m., symbolized a moment that the school was perpetually trying to erase. A moment when its facade of elite education collapsed into dark, forgotten actions. One particularly stressful week, following an internal investigation into cheating that led to the expulsion of 3 students, Liam noticed the bell had tolled 4 times in a row. 4 times, all at 3 a.m. The last toll was the loudest, shaking his window pane. The next morning, the headmaster, a man of iron will and terrifying composure, was found collapsed in his office, suffering from a massive stroke that left him paralyzed and unable to speak. The official report cited stress and old age, but Liam knew the truth. The tower had finally claimed a heavy toll, punishing the highest authority for his recent, merciless actions. The real horror of St. Jude's was that the building itself had become the conscience, an ancient, metallic judge whose hammer blow was the only thing capable of enforcing justice against the institutionalized silence. Liam graduated, carrying the weight of those single chimes with him, always checking his clock at 3 a.m., knowing the silent bell tower was keeping tally. and that the history of St. Jude's was far from over, awaiting the next moment of injustice to register its terrifying, singular chime. He often wondered if the initial lightning strike in 1952 wasn't an accident, but the tower's first desperate attempt to silence itself, before it was forced to become the chronicler of the school's slow decay into cruelty. Finally, we arrive at the tale of Hawthorne Academy, a small, financially struggling public school in a quiet suburban area, a place where the biggest scandal was usually a lost field hockey trophy. This story, known locally as the Library Anomaly, concerns the school's library, which was built in the late 1960s as a standalone annex. Unlike the rest of the school, the library was built quickly and cheaply, and was plagued by architectural oddities, strange, useless internal windows, hallways that dead-ended abruptly, and most notably, a sealed-off section on the second floor. This section, marked only by a heavy reinforced steel door and a brass plate that read reference, "Do not enter structural instability," became the focus of intense student speculation. Officially, the section contained obsolete, heavy reference books deemed too dangerous to move due to the weak floor supports underneath. Unofficially, students whispered it held the school's darkest secrets, the records of the results of strange psychological experiments conducted in the 80s, or perhaps even the journals of the school's eccentric founder, Elias Hawthorne, who died mysteriously on the school grounds. The sealed section was located directly adjacent to the main study tables, where students spent hours preparing for exams. The horror began not with a ghost, but with the subtle, insidious decay of the mind in those who studied closest to the door. Students who routinely sat at the table nearest the sealed section table 4 started exhibiting behavioral changes. They weren't just stressed. They were becoming obsessed, paranoid, and frighteningly methodical in their academic pursuits. One girl, Sarah, started studying 18 hours a day, refusing to sleep, fueled only by black coffee and the terrifying certainty that if she failed, a penalty would be exacted. Her handwriting changed, becoming tiny, rigid, and looping, covering every blank space on her notebooks with mathematical precision, pages that looked more like code than notes. She claimed the room was whispering answers to her, specifically from the sealed section. She said the books inside weren't obsolete, they were waiting. The faculty dismissed it as exam stress. Then, a boy named Mark, who had sat at the same table, became convinced that every book he touched in the main library was subtly wrong. He started ripping out pages, claiming they contained false histories deliberately planted to mislead students. He was found one night trying to pry open the steel door with a crowbar, screaming that he needed the original, untainted source to save the world. He was subsequently removed from the school. The common factor was always prolonged exposure near that steel door, specifically at table 4, a small group of senior students, terrified by these escalating incidents, finally decided to investigate the door itself. They found that the brass plate, when cleaned of years of grime, was not simply decorative. It was warm to the touch, and if you pressed your ear against the cold steel door, you could hear a low, barely perceptible sound, like thousands of pages rustling in a perpetual draft. Even though the room was sealed airtight, using an old electronic stethoscope borrowed from the science lab, they amplified the sound and recorded it. The audio wasn't just paper rustling. It was a chorus of dry, high-pitched whispers, overlapping and impossible to decipher, all emanating from the closed space. When they played the recording back, the students who had sat at table 4 instantly broke down, covering their ears and sobbing, claiming the sounds were trying to fill the empty space in their minds. The true nature of the sealed section was finally revealed, not through a ghost, but through the evidence of its psychological influence. The architectural instability was real, but it wasn't due to the weight of books. It was due to a void, a place where the foundation had settled unevenly, and this structural flaw created a resonant chamber that amplified an ambient, disturbing noise, a constant, low-frequency hum that directly affected the human brain, causing extreme paranoia, obsession, and breakdown. The obsolete books were a lie to keep the students away from the unsettling truth. The silence was the danger. The sound waves emanating from that acoustically imperfect, structurally unsound room were psychologically damaging, feeding on the vulnerable minds of stressed, isolated students. The staff knew the danger and sealed the room, not for books, but to contain the sound anomaly created by the structural failure. But the thin wall was not enough, and the hum, the whispering, still bled through to Table 4, subtly tearing apart the minds of the school's most dedicated students. The horror of Hawthorne Academy wasn't a legend. It was a simple, disturbing truth of poor construction and the terrible price paid for studying too close to a permanent architectural mistake. The steel door was simply the school's attempt to keep the structural psychic collapse quiet, hoping that a layer of steel and a brass plaque would be enough to contain the real, unseen reason for the students' slow, terrifying decline.